Hi, and welcome to another episode of Kasper On BI. I'm very excited to see you all here again, and today we're going to learn about data flows. How do you position them? What do they mean for your organization? How are they different than data sets? What are some pitfalls that you can think about? And to learn about data flows, I've invited an expert, Matthew Roche. And Matthew is a colleague of mine at Microsoft, and he has blogged and made videos about data flows and how to position them on his channel, which I'll put links down in the description too. So without further ado, let's go ahead and listen to Matthew talking about data flows. So let's go to the show. Hi, Matthew. It's great to have you on the show. It's really an honor, and it's good to see you in person, kind of. So it's great to have you here on the show at Kasper On BI, and today we're going to talk about data flows.
So it's awesome. It is great to be here. Thank you for having me. And any chance that I get to talk about data flows, you know that it's hard to shut me up once I get started.
Exactly. That's what we're hoping for today too. and I mentioned it in the intro too. But you already have an amazing blogs and you have an amazing videos on data flows too. So I'll put them in the links too for people to look at.
Awesome.
Because now we're talking like about an hour, but I think in there, I don't know how many hours of discussions and talks you have about data flows and other interesting concepts. But there's a lot more to learn in those pages and videos.
Yeah, the thing that I think was a real advantage for me is being a member of the Power BI customer advisory team. I had early access to data flows even before there was a preview that most people could access. So I got the chance to come in with some of the early intro content. And if you look at some of the older blog posts, they're kind of dated. I haven't kept them up to date because there's so many more great voices out there now. But the thing that I think that will be super valuable on my blog that I haven't seen in other places is some of the patterns and more conceptual content around data flows, because it's not just a tool, it fits into that broader end-to-end architecture in a way that if you're only looking at the details, it could be sometimes easy to miss.
Yeah. That's really good. So maybe let's talk a bit of ancient history. Maybe you can talk about your interesting path, where you started and your career and in school and before you started working at Microsoft, because I know a little bit and it's pretty interesting. So.
Well, so this could be a long story, so I'll try to make the short version. So I was a computer science major in college, but I never actually finished a degree. I was much more interested in sex and drugs and rock and roll when I was young, and my GPA sort of demonstrated that those priorities. I fell into an IT career in the 90s. So I was working as a technical trainer in Albuquerque, where my wife was going to graduate school. I was basically along for the ride and found that what I had learned in college was very useful. Having a context in which to apply it made me actually learn the things that I'd heard in college but hadn't sunk in, and that I was good at training. I was good at explaining things. And over the course of maybe 5 years or so, I went from being an application trainer who would teach people how to use Word and Windows 95 and Excel and Access, to being a development manager for a .com era consulting company with about 40 people on my team. We grew and rode that .com wave. But at that point, I had my first child. We moved back to the rural upstate New York area where my wife and I are both from, sort of took a detour from that path and built a consulting practice, focused more and more, not just on the development side, but on the data side, which has always been a real passion for me. I became a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, or MVP, for the work that I was doing in the community around SQL Server integration services. And when I joined, exactly, the good old days, the data flows, as it were. And when I joined Microsoft in 2008, I spent my first 3 years working on the Microsoft learning team. Because of my training background, I was actually helping that group improve the quality of their training products. And after that, I joined the SQL Server Integration Services team as a program manager. After that, I worked on master data services, data quality services, Power BI V1, and Azure Data Catalog. So lots of ETL, data governance, data curation concepts. Because honestly, this is my happy place. I love data. I'm awful at data visualization. You never want me building a report, but getting the right data in the right place at the right time to deliver business value for all of the people that need it, but don't know, they may not know what they need, or they may not be able to find it or access it. Those are problems that I love to solve. And we're recording this on Friday the 5th. Next Monday is actually my 3-year anniversary on the Power BI CAT team. So it was almost exactly 3 years ago that I joined the team, and hopefully we'll be able to get back together in person and not just Skyping long distance. Exactly.
It's like a long distance relationship, Matthew.
Yes, indeed.
And so how was it for you? Like maybe it's a little bit not Dataflows, but how was it for you? I kind of have a similar background, right? Like a development, early .com wave. How did you find it to move from like a consulting role to work at Microsoft and building products?
So it was awful. So I don't want to scare anyone off, but I was always a very small fish, or like a medium-sized fish in a very small pond, and one of the things that I used to say is that I would thrive in chaos and uncertainty because that would make it easy for me to make a Matthew-shaped hole in the mess. And what I found when I joined Microsoft, and I assumed that this would be any big company with an established culture and lots of stuff going on, was that it took me much longer than I ever could have expected to figure out what are the levers that I would need to put pressure on to make changes that in the past I could drive those changes on a small scale without really thinking about it. And the thing that I found on most of the teams that I worked on, and a lot of this is like old Microsoft, like the Steve Ballmer era before Satya became CEO and drove a lot of very positive cultural change, is that most of the work that I enjoy the most and am best at is enabling the success of others that I work with. So I might not be delivering a thing, but I'm providing services and information and connections and capabilities so that others can build faster, better products. Mm-hmm. For a lot of my time at Microsoft, that was not valued. So I was successful for the things that I was trying to do, but it wasn't really being recognized and rewarded. And the thing that I love both about the CAT team that I'm on now and the Power BI team in general is that the culture is just so positive, and the type of impact that I make, and you're nodding and smiling, you may feel the same way. I feel like I'm making a bigger difference and being much more appreciated, both in thanks and in the end of year review and reward cycle than I had been at any point earlier in my Microsoft career.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely feel it's kind of similar in the career and working at Microsoft, and I definitely felt that shift too from Ballmer to Satya era. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your current role in the Power BI CAT team too, because it's pretty interesting.
Cool. Yeah. So from a general perspective, the Power BI CAT team, we represent the voice of the enterprise customer for the Power BI product team. So we have some, everybody knows, well, everybody who is likely to be watching this video knows Guys in Cube. So Adam Saxton, Patrick LeBlanc, some of these very visible community members. So if you think about those two examples, there is a breadth of skill and a depth of knowledge, both about the product, the solution domain that Power BI represents as a product, and the problem domain of enterprise business intelligence and analytics. So our team bridges large enterprise customers. So we only work with big organizations. There are other teams that help smaller customers and do more direct community work. And the product team, the people that are building the roadmap and prioritizing what we invest in first and what we defer for later, and then designing, delivering, and supporting the features that make Power BI, in the weekly service updates and the monthly desktop updates. We're one of the main inputs to let them know where people are struggling, where we can improve, how the product can improve. And when I joined the team, a lot of what we did was very reactive. So imagine, this is the fictional example, but imagine the CEO of some Fortune 10 company getting on the phone with a Microsoft executive, yelling at them about the problems that they were having, and that executive, working down the org chart so that our team would then engage in that escalation to make sure that the customer was successful today. And keep in mind, these are customers that, as a rule, they are pushing the edge of what the platform is capable of. So they're trying to do things more scale, more concurrency, more volume, more everything.
Yeah. I usually call it tip of the spear.
Yeah, tip of the spear. That's perfect. So we make them successful today, and we then send that feedback and that learning to the engineering and PM teams that can make it so that the next time someone tries to do the same, tip of the spear, cutting edge problem to solve it with Power BI, the product just does it because we learned, we grew, we evolved. And being in this situation, or being in this opportunity where we can share information and advice, helping people today, and feed it back into the product team to help everybody tomorrow, it's like, oh, beautiful sweet spot. Yeah. And what I've done is I've found ways to more programmatically engage with some of the key folks from some of our largest customers. I've designed and am executing, with help from the rest of the team, a program that we call Power BI Enterprise Voice that allows us to more systematically and proactively learn from these big organizations what are the business goals that they're working to achieve, how they use Power BI and Azure and the rest of the Power Platform to achieve those goals, and where they struggle today. And by having this broad body of knowledge, we're able to inform and solve problems before anybody gets on the phone to yell at anybody else.
Exactly. I think we have to keep this part of the session, and now we can reuse it internally too when we tell people about what the cat team does. That's good.
Excellent.
All right, so let's talk about Dataflows. Yay. So what is Dataflows?
It's a self-service data preparation capability inside of Power BI. So do you want more than that?
Yeah, maybe.
So let's actually step back a little bit and let's think about ETL and data preparation in general. So a lot of what business intelligence and analytics are about is using data for a purpose that it wasn't created to be used for. So most data today is being produced by an OLTP system, like connected devices for IoT scenarios. There's lots of data being produced, but for the most part, it's not being produced for analytics. It's being produced from some other or for some other purpose. And BI is about taking it and using it to answer either questions that we know to ask today or questions that we might not know to ask yet, but we still need that information available. And with ETL, it's about extracting the data from the systems where it is originally produced, transforming it into the shape that it needs to be in. So, going from a normalized model to a star schema is sort of the canonical example here, and then loading it into the downstream analytics system that we can do our reporting or whatever on top of. And traditionally, a tool like SQL Server Integration Services or Informatica or Talend or Azure Data Factory, these tools tend to be heavyweight data professional tools. If you give your business analyst SQL Server Integration Services, like, oh, here's your Visual Studio, go do what you need, most analysts won't be successful. And in Power BI V1, so go back to like the 2013 era, when Power BI was a collection of Excel add-ins and a collection of things in SharePoint Online, one of the things that we introduced was Power Query. So Power Query is a self-service ETL or a data preparation tool that will allow any Excel user or Power BI desktop user today to do a lot of the same things that a professional ETL developer would do in ADF or integration services, but to do it in a way that is optimized for that persona. And it really unlocked this huge volume of new capabilities and new scenarios, and it hooked everybody that found it. So there's no one that uses Power Query that doesn't fall in love with it. And if you're that one guy, email Kasper. He'll talk to you. But until Dataflows, the work performed in a Power Query query was only loading data into the tabular analytics model that was either your Power Pivot model in Excel or the data set in Power BI, which basically meant that all of the logic that went into that transformation, it could not effectively or simply be reused. And in the last few months, Power BI has introduced more capabilities for reusing data sets in the Power BI service. But as a general rule, reusing upstream data that's not already in the analytics optimized model, it tends to perform better and scale better. I don't know if we want to drill into that today, but basically, Dataflows, to get back to your question, Dataflows are that self-service data preparation tool that is built on top of Power Query. So it's running Power Query, the user experience in the browser, and the mashup container, like the process that does all of the actual transformation work. It's running it in the Power BI service in the cloud, and it's loading the data into a cloud-based location that is designed for ease of discovery and ease of reuse. So now, when a business analyst or other Power Query user is implementing this data transformation logic, they're building their queries, instead of having it being trapped inside the data model or the data set, it's now available for broad reuse in multiple data sets by multiple people in multiple workspaces. And it really allows more reuse and discovery in a way that hasn't been possible through self-service tools, and honestly hasn't been readily possible with a lot of professional tools as well, at least from a discovery perspective.
So I don't need a data warehouse anymore.
Oh, who needs a data warehouse, right? It's 2021. So no. So don't listen to that. That was sarcastic Matthew speaking. A data warehouse is more than just a place for your ETL process to dump data. So if you think either about a traditional relational data warehouse or a modern data warehouse built on a cloud platform like Azure Synapse Analytics, it's not just having the data where you can reuse it. There are lots of capabilities around performance tuning, around scale, around flexibility, around management. And Dataflows and Power BI, at least as of March 2021, don't really check all of those checkboxes particularly well. So the short answer is, if you have a small scale like data mart, so think you've got megabytes, sorry, not megabytes, a low number of gigabytes worth of data, and a reasonable flexibility on refresh and load times and the like, Dataflows might be a decent solution for that. But if we look at the implementation under the hood, and keep in mind, I don't have a script prepared here, so there may be things that I won't explicitly mention. I'm not about to tell you exactly everything that Dataflows does. But if you look at Dataflows under the hood, the output of your Power Query's execution, so somebody hits refresh or a refresh is scheduled, the Power Queries run through that mashup engine. The data that's being produced is being written into CDM folders, or common data model folders, that are managed by the Power BI service. The physical implementation of this is folders full of CSV data with a JSON file for metadata. And the metadata gives us friendly column names and data types and discovery and things like that. But the physical storage is a folder in Azure that has CSV data in it. And Dataflows perform like folders full of CSV data. So if you have many, many gigabytes worth of data in SQL Server or Azure SQL DB or another robust, fully featured database platform, you build indexes. There's a lot of performance optimization that you can do. With Dataflows, that is not the case. And Dataflows does have a capability which is only available in Power BI Premium. And now with Premium per user, I expect that more people will take advantage of this. But this capability is known as the Enhanced Compute Engine. And basically how this works is when you refresh your data flow and the data is being produced by that mashup engine, in addition to being written to the CSV files and those CDM folders, it is also being written into a SQL instance that is managed by the Power BI service. So you can't directly access this SQL database, but the data is being written into tables on which a column store index is automatically built, so that downstream data flows that are refreshing against those data flows, they're hitting that SQL cache. And not only they have better performance because it's in SQL and it's indexed, they can also take advantage of Power Query capabilities like query folding. So you can get a dramatic performance increase there. But at the same time, and there is actually a blog post with a title like "Will it fold?" on my blog. So we'll remember to put a link in the description below for that. But there are scenarios where that SQL cache produced and maintained by the Enhanced Compute Engine will be used, and there are other situations where it will not be used. So to get back to your question, can Dataflows replace your data warehouse? If it's really a data warehouse, probably not. If it is a small data mart, probably. But it's not just about the data itself. You need to look at that big picture to make sure that the tool that you're selecting is solving both the functional requirements, which is what as technical professionals we often think of, but making sure that you have insight into things like monitoring, like troubleshooting, the flexibility for your load schedule. Data flows have full and incremental refresh, but this is often not all that a data warehouse needs. Sometimes you need more control than that. So definitely look closely. And if anyone ever says to you, "Oh, now with Dataflows, nobody needs a data warehouse anymore," that should be a flashing red light that you need to be skeptical about what this person tells you.
But I think it also probably depends on the scenario, right? You mentioned it a little bit, but like if you do full-blown like departmental or enterprise-wide BI solutions, then you probably want to make sure you structure the data in such a way that you have a data warehouse and it's more you have ADF and you check it in and you run processes and the IT team manages it, and it's a different scale than, or maybe not scales, maybe not the right word, but it's a different team and it has different needs and it's managed differently than in Dataflows, because there it's probably more about the business user or someone in a small scale project that says, okay, we need to get some data now, and but we do want to structure it nicely.
Yeah, and that we want to get the data now, I honestly think is a real key aspect of when data flows are often obviously the right tool. So the dynamics between the needs of business users, the analysts or the people that they support, so they often have emerging dynamic small scale needs like, oh, I need a column added, or I need this additional table added, and I need it this week or today to support this new priority in this campaign that we're starting next week, something along those lines. They go to the IT department and there's like a change request board, and there's all of the rigor that you need to go through for different environments, and it might be months before a small scale request is prioritized. So with Dataflows, it's easy to create the things that you need that IT hasn't yet created, and then even though there's no direct tooling to support this operationalization path, the fact that you've built a Power Query-based ETL process, you have a functional prototype that when you are getting onto the IT teams or the data warehousing teams schedule, you'll be able to use that as part of the requirements that you're handing off. And again, getting back to, you mentioned things like source control and application lifecycle management, and tying into the rigor that enterprise data and IT systems require. This is something that is not part of most self-service workloads, but it's something that for a true data warehouse, you definitely need to keep into consideration because of the broad reliability and stability that they need.
Yeah. So maybe again, a little bit devil's advocate, but okay. So why don't I just load it into Power BI desktop in a data set that I have there and do the same things? Why would I use Dataflows?
So let's think about reuse. And let's say that you, as a business analyst, you come through and you need to create your curated customer list. So you have the official data source that you can pull, like from whatever IT managed system,
some SAP system somewhere,
Yeah. So you pull some things from SAP, you pull other things from other locations. Like, this is the value add that you're producing. If you do this in Power BI Desktop, and you have your PBIX file, which is basically your source code for that Power BI solution, you publish it into a data set. At some point, someone is going to look at it and say, I need this thing, but slightly different. And at that point, the most likely approach, and please push back and play devil's advocate for more, but the most likely approach that two business users will take is the first one says, oh, here's my PBIX file. You can use this as a starting point. And then the other guy takes it and modifies it and publishes it. And now you have two versions of the same data with different implementation, and this drift, this cruft has entered the system. And typically it only gets work from there. So each one of these will spawn its own children or grandchildren. And if that query, so the query that you built in Power BI Desktop for one of the tables in your tabular model, if that query had been defined in a data flow in the service, not only would that first conversation not need to happen, because as long as I have permissions, I can go and find it, explore it, and use it. But there's one common thing. And even if I then use your data flow as a starting point and make other modifications to it, because it's in the Power BI service, it's in this fully managed environment, there's automatically information about lineage and impact analysis, so that either I, as the owner of the upstream data flow, or I, as an administrator in Power BI, I can see, here's the thing, I'm trying to get my boxes correct. So I've got this thing that was created upstream, and I have these things that are using it downstream. It's easy to understand the impact and how things are being used. And as the owner and actually, so as I say this, I remember this is not yet available in production. So I'm not talking about any commitment to shipping something, but I assume that in the reasonable future, this will be available for data flows as well as for data sets. But Power BI has impact analysis capabilities where if I'm making a change to that upstream asset, I will automatically be able to see all of the downstream uses of it, so that I can notify the owners that I'm adding a column or changing the data type of a column. The sorts of things that in any ETL system, whether it's IT driven or self-service like data flows often are, that fragility of upstream changes breaking downstream processes Dataflows make that much easier to manage because of the managed nature of the Power BI service.
So maybe that kind of goes back to like, so when I create a data flow, so do you think people, when they are using data flows, they have to be mindful of sharing it and giving it to other people? Because I think by default, probably it's not available for everyone, right? So do you need to share it?
So Dataflow permissions are actually managed at the workspace level. So if you are a contributor to the workspace, you will be able to access and consume the data from those data flows either in the same workspace or otherwise. But let me actually step back and answer that question from a bigger picture perspective. Mm-hmm. One thing that I've heard several large enterprise Power BI customers mention is that in addition to the citizen analysts that they've had working in Power BI or the citizen app developers that they have working in Power Apps, they're now starting to use the phrase citizen data engineers. And this is basically another class of Power BI user. And it's not an official Microsoft thing, but I've heard this from more than one customer where they've basically said, these are people that have the business expertise and the Power Query knowledge to create these reusable things. But mostly business users, they don't have the mindset about creating data assets for broader reuse. They're about solving a problem and moving on to the next problem to solve. So these large customers, they've mentioned that they are explicitly identifying and training these citizen data engineers to think about reuse and then to apply best practices patterns for using data flows to solve the problem that you're asking about here. So does someone need to think about data flows and the sharing and the longer term life cycle to be successful? No. Mm. Do you need to think about that in order to have the greatest impact and reach from your work? Yes.
So you think, and so again, is it maybe like, again, so now we're back to enterprise versus departmental versus, so do you think, probably like when you're in a big finance department or something like this, mm-hmm. you work together with your coworkers on this and you say, okay, I have this data available, everyone has access to it, yep. Go use it, or both?
So I would say yes, and so the pattern that you just described is pretty common, but I actually want to use one of my examples because it's something that I can speak to directly. So going back to that Power BI Enterprise Voice program that we mentioned during the Matthew working at Microsoft introduction, yeah. we have data that we produce that is related to what customers have reported what problems as part of their interactions with the program. And I produce and publish a set of reports that people on my team and people on the Power BI product team use as part of their ongoing rhythms of business. So I have never explicitly promoted to them, here's a data flow that these reports are based on. Mm. But when I produce the report, and this, I don't know if we want to go too far down this path, but I will often iterate when I'm doing Power BI app development, and I will, get things done, and then I will take my queries and move them into data flows because I'm just more productive building a data set to start with. But for this application, I publish the app with all the reports in it, and on those occasions when someone says, oh, this is great, but I really want the data, when they do that, I point them to the data set. Yeah. And I know that there's at least 5 or 6 people, which isn't a huge audience, but there's at least 5 or 6 people that have independently found the data flows upstream, and they've just started using them because they're there.
So you point them to the data flows?
No, they were able to see they were able to see the app, and because they know how Power BI works, and maybe they know that I'm a data flow guy, and because they had permissions in the workspace, they basically went looking and said, oh, this is the Power BI Enterprise Voice data flow. I'll use this, because I can discover it. I can, preview the data and start working with it. And obviously this is this is a specific example, but it's representative of a lot of the patterns that I see for that departmental work. Having the data flows as part of the app, you might have the explicit handoff. This is where you get the data, or you might have that implicit discovery where people just look for it because they see the data being visualized in the report, and then they go looking to see where it came from.
Yeah, makes sense. So maybe another question, which is kind of also related. So now we also have composite models. So you can actually go in and say, okay, give me this table, or I want to reuse one table that someone has already created. How does it overlap and compare?
So I'm really interested to see how this plays out. So I honestly I don't know. The fact that the different physical implementations will have different functional restrictions, different performance characteristics, different security patterns. I am really interested to see, but even though, again, it's March and we shipped the direct query over Power BI datasets into Azure Analysis Services models, we shipped that in preview in December. I literally haven't touched it yet. It's on my to-do list, but it never makes it near the top of it. So they are tools that have similar capabilities, but I'm not yet in a position where I can say use one in one situation and use the other in another situation.
Well,
so probably, hopefully someone will answer that.
I would think the only difference, really the difference that I can see is when you're using data flows and when you're connecting to that data, you are still in the M world. So you can make more changes to it and you move and then you move the data in. With the composite models, although you can do direct query against data flows too, so then things become a bit more in the same. But with composite models, you can make changes to it with calculated columns, but it's small compared to what you can do in the M and the data flows world.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point that I haven't mentioned earlier. That by default, data flows are an import mode data source. That enhanced compute engine does allow direct query because the DQ goes against the SQL-based cache. But when you are using them in import mode, you have all the flexibility to do whatever arbitrary transformations you want using data flows as the source.
Yeah. So maybe take a step back because you were mentioning some other things like CDM. So what else can I do with that?
So all right. So I'm going to read between the lines of the question. So let me know if this is the direction that you were hoping I'd go in. So the fact that data flows store their data as a CDM folder opens up opportunities for reuse, but not by default. So by default, so if you don't change any settings, the CSV files and JSON metadata are in a location that Power BI, like the Power BI service or Power BI desktop, are the only tools that can read or write. So you don't have access to it. But you can, in the Power BI service, either at the tenant level or at the workspace level, configure your own Azure Data Lake storage resource. So it's an ADLS Gen 2 resource that lives in your Azure subscription. You can configure Power BI to write data into that location that you specify so that when your data flow refreshes, the data is being written into a location that you control the permissions to, so that you can have data being produced by a data flow going into the lake, where it is then used by Azure Data Factory or Synapse or Azure Machine Learning or any service or application that has permission to access it. And the fact that it's just CSV and JSON means that that everybody can work with it. Going in the other direction, it is also possible to take a CDM folder that has been created by another service or application, because again, just JSON and CSV, and you can attach that to your Power BI workspace as an external data flow, which basically means that for this external data flow, the processing and ETL logic is taking place outside of Power BI. But from an end user's perspective, when I'm going in and searching or browsing through my workspaces to find data flows with data that I need, it shows up as just another data flow. And as a consumer, I don't care if that data is being produced by Data Factory, by a custom Python script, or by M running in somebody's Power Query online.
All right, that's pretty cool. And like the CDM touched on a lot of other things too inside of the Microsoft's ecosystem, right? And yeah, we're betting on pretty big in our organization, so there's lots of things that are be connected to it. So it's pretty cool and pretty interesting to watch. So maybe that ties into another question, like data lakes and data lake strategies. And so how do I tie in data flows with my data lake strategy?
So it depends.
Of course.
So I think that the nicest thing is that it makes it very easy to get data that is being produced through self-service efforts into your lake. So everybody's data lake strategy is going to be different. So I'm honestly not sure how to respond in general to the question, but by having your Power BI tenant or workspace configured to use your data lake resource, all of the work that's being done with whatever scope or within whatever scope you've configured in Power BI, that data is now in a location and in a format where it can be viewed and managed and reused by the lake team. And it allows it to just integrate more easily. And unlike I don't want to say a lot of other tools because I don't have a specific example in mind, but there's no transformation required. The nice thing with the Azure Data Lake integration is that this is a location that Power BI can natively read and write to, and that common data model folder format is a common persistence format that multiple services know how to read and know how to write. So, if I think about SQL Server. So this is where I cut my teeth on data back in the day, and I remember doing a select star from sys objects. Even back before it was sys dot objects. Oh, wow. That's some old school there. But if you think about that type of metadata, SQL Server has its own proprietary data format and proprietary metadata format. And every other database platform has the same. And there's like some standardization, but there's no way that you could take a query from SQL Server and expect it to run on Oracle or Informix or DB2. It might, but only if you target that least common denominator. And there's zero chance that you could take the bits from a SQL Server database file and do anything with them in another tool. With the CDM folder format and the CDM metadata, it's designed to have the anybody can write it, anybody can read it, simple as possible format, so that because it's CSV and JSON with this well-documented structure, there is many more opportunities for code-free or minimal code integration between different services, and not just Microsoft first-party services as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think maybe you did mention it, but I want to be a bit more explicit about it. By default, when you start using Dataflows and when you have Power BI, it uses our data lake under the covers. Mm-hmm. But you can bring your own data lake, right? So as an admin, you have to go in and say, okay, this is our data lake. We don't want to use Microsoft data lake. This is our data lake. And that data lake is open for everyone in your organization to do stuff on.
Yes.
All right. So maybe and this is maybe a bit of a teaser too. So are Dataflows master data management?
So no. Or are they? So when Dataflows first came out, and keep in mind as a reminder, I worked on SQL Server master data services back in the day. So this is an area where I spent some time. I've forgotten most of it, so I'm certainly not an expert. But when Dataflows were first introduced in preview, this is a question that I saw popping up everywhere. And my initial reaction was, what the heck are these people thinking? Obviously, this is nothing to do with master data. And then I stepped back a little and looked at the patterns behind the question. And in many ways, people think about master data as having a single version of the truth that can be reused in many other places. And if we look at it only through this very, very narrow definition, data flows, when used appropriately or when used to this end, may be thought of as a master data kind of tool. But if you look at any mature master data tool that's out there, an actual master data management product, master data tools have dedicated capabilities around the security and curation and versioning of the data that is in the tool. So like cell level security and being able to track all of the changes, like source control over the data itself. And they're designed with dedicated capabilities around versioning and integration and snapshotting and what have you. And if we look at this bigger picture, if we expand it out, absolutely not. Data flows are absolutely not a master data management tool. But to get back to the original kind of yes, maybe, most smaller customers are not using the big master data. Yeah. They basically want an Excel spreadsheet and a little bit more. And if that's how you think about master data, data flows could definitely be part of that solution, where you continue to do the mastering work, the actual curation, the care and feeding of the data values. Keep doing that in your Excel that is stored on SharePoint, or in your SharePoint list with the versioning and history and stuff turned on, and then have your data flow entities get the data from that source or those sources and make it available for downstream consumption from there.
That makes sense. So maybe another interesting question too, because we see this quite regularly in our enterprise stories and enterprise customers too. But how do I govern the data flows?
So they govern themselves. Obviously, that's a tongue-in-cheek response as well. But data flows are a managed object type inside the Power BI service. So Power BI has both admin metadata APIs. So with the right permissions and in a PowerShell window, you can enumerate all of the data flows in all of the workspaces in your tenant or that you have permission to, get the downstream lineage, get the upstream lineage about where the data is coming from, and really get a broad idea of what's being used where. And I can't emphasize how stunningly important and valuable this is, because that data lineage and impact analysis problem, it plagues every data warehousing, data lake, and ETL tool and implementation, because it's really hard to authoritatively say, where does this data come from and how is it being transformed, or where is this data being used and who is using it? And with data flows, because they are a fully managed part of the Power BI service, common questions that are difficult in other unmanaged environments become trivial to answer. And the more complex questions, like thinking about usage, those metadata APIs won't give you that entire picture, but they can be merged with data either from the Office 365 audit logs or the Power BI activity API, which does a lot of what those audit logs do, but doesn't require you to be an Office 365 administrator to access. So with those two things, the governance becomes trivial, assuming that you know what your goals for governance are, because the hard part of governance is almost never the technology, it's the culture and the process and rigor that goes around the governance.
That makes a lot of sense. So maybe that ties me into another interesting question. And another area I know you're pretty passionate about. So let's say you are a center of excellence of a big company, and you want to tell your business users, your people in your organization, how should they think about data flows and how should they implement it? And what should they think about doing?
So I wasn't prepared to answer this question, so I'm going to be making this up as I speak. But if I were part of that COE, the Center of Excellence, and I was like delivering an intro training or an awareness, webcast for my team focused on data flows, the thing that I would ask them is, as you're building a Power BI solution, ask yourself, who could use this data that I'm producing? I'm doing ETL and Power Query one way or another. But is it possible for that data to be valuable and have value from reuse outside of the app that I'm building today? And if it is, consider having your Power Query queries loading into a data flow and having the data set built on top of that data flow instead of having the data set going directly against those upstream sources. So this would be the high level guidance. And then beyond that, this would tie back into that concept of the citizen data engineer, where there are concepts like, what is the scope of reuse, and how should I stage data and transform data and enrich data in different ways. There's a lot of data warehousing and ETL knowledge that's out there that has been developed. Think about the Kimball's data warehousing toolkit as an example. So this is my introduction to this space, where it's a generational thing. I think you'd be amazed how many people who are working with data today that have not read this amazing book. But the idea of having data land it in a staging location first with either no transformation or the least transformation possible. So you land it in one data flow as staging, and then as necessary, you have downstream data flows. And when I say downstream, I mean they're using the original staging data flows as their sources, but you've got the downstream data flows where you do things like cleansing or standardization or enrichment, making it more useful for other downstream purposes. And then the final thing that you do is to get it into your star schema to build the data set or other model on top of. But there is no one size fits all here. For most business teams, this is overkill. This is, they're going to glaze out and they're just never going to come back to ask the next question. So you need to work with your understanding of the skill level and the personas and what they're interested in, and find the right ways to enable them to do enough so that they can be successful without ongoing IT involvement, but are also setting themselves up for longer term success. And in a worst case scenario, if a business user deploys either one giant data flow or a data set without data flows, because all of that ETL logic is defined in Power Query, the work to go from a fully business developed functional mess into something that has been factored and is more scalable and maintainable, produced by an IT team. Power Query, it's like the lingua franca of data in the Power BI stack. So you can take that, the queries developed by one person or one team, and more easily refactor them and have the original available for more automated testing to make sure that the data values and the counts are what you need them to be.
And I think maybe one interesting thing, and actually I don't know. So how can you, like we talked about a little bit, you said, okay, you can make a workspace and you can give them access, but are there any other ways to make things discoverable, like which data flows that you've created?
So not today. So there's this is where I will be treading a fine line, because as a member of the Power BI as a member of the Power BI Cat team, I get to see a lot of work in progress, and as a not quite young anymore professional, I sometimes don't remember what we're talking about publicly yet and what we're not. So I'm going to say that there are some interesting capabilities around discovery that are that I hear in conversations. But when I think about discovery of data flows, at least in Power BI today, you need to have permissions on the workspace in order to know that the workspace and the data flows inside it exist. So it's not as discoverable as it could be, but there is integration in between the Power BI service, which includes data flows, and enterprise data catalog products like Azure Purview and Informatica that can ease a lot of these challenges. I know that a lot of organizations do not have an enterprise data catalog because they tend to be pricey and they tend to require more care and feeding or more dedicated ownership in order to get the return on the investment. And a lot of organizations just aren't ready to make that commitment. So I do see quite a few, even larger companies, they'll have an internal portal like a SharePoint site or a Jira wiki, or there's some site where you can go and see these are the things that are available, and this is the way that you request access so that you can start using them yourself. And this sort of ad hoc organizational data catalog is probably the most common discovery mechanism that I see beyond the get data dialogue in Power BI.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. I think, we've talked about a lot of interesting things, and I think we've learned a lot too. Is there maybe some last tips and tricks that you want to share or talk about with data flows?
So I would say that the thing that I would like everyone using Power BI to think about is that data flows are the low-hanging fruit for data reuse. If you're building queries in Power Query, whether it's in Excel or Power BI Desktop or any of the other places where Power Query lives, so there's a lot of it out there, data flows allow you to take the exact same skill set and the exact same queries, like the code, you can copy and paste queries or groups of queries between tools. It allows you to take the data we're doing and make it easily reusable and discoverable by others. So for me, every Power BI app that I build has data flows in between the data sources and the data set. 100% of them, it's the rigor that I have built over the past couple of years. Even if you don't do that, think about the opportunities for reuse. So again, ask yourself, the data that I'm producing for the reports or the app that I'm building today, could it be valuable elsewhere? If it is, create a data flow. And if you discover after the fact that the things that are in your data set really need more reuse than the data set is going to give you the options for, retrofitting a data set to use data flows as an intermediary step. I want to say that it's trivial, so your mileage may vary, but it's really straightforward, where you can go into your PBIX file, copy a folder or individual query, you copy it, paste it into Power Query Online, just go through, do that for all of the queries, mark them, enable load or disable load as appropriate, get the data flow up and running, and then you can simply go into Power Query and Power BI Desktop and replace the M code that's in there now with the code that just directly references the data flow. So, it might take you an afternoon if you have a non-trivial application, but this type of retrofitting a data set allows you to target today's problem today, but still have a straightforward path to solve tomorrow's problems when they sneak up on you.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think the other good thing is it just runs in the cloud, right? So you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to press refresh. It's up to date. And if it's big and it's using a lot of CPU and memory, you don't care. It's just running there, and it's just there when you need it.
Yes, it is just there when you need it. And the thing that I love for my, the core app that I care about, the data, I've got like a nightly refresh for the data flow and then for the data set, and it just works. And on the odd occasion when something does go wrong, like one of the upstream data sources is offline for maintenance or what have you, I get an email. So I, come in the morning, and there in my inbox is an email saying this data flow failed to refresh, and I can go in and view the history and do all the things that I want to do. And it just simplifies everything. Data flows, making your life better since 2018.
Yes, that's a nice thing. All right. I think we've learned a lot about Dataflows there. I mean, there's many more things to talk about, and I will definitely put the links to your YouTube channel and blogs in the description, because there's much more to talk about it.
Awesome.
But I really want to thank you. I mean, I think we've learned a lot about Dataflows and what it's for and what it's about. So yeah, thank you, and talk to you the next time.
Thank you very much. We'll see you on the team meeting Monday morning or Monday evening for you. And thanks to everybody who's made it this far. It's been a real pleasure. So take care, Kasper.
And that concludes another episode of Kasper On BI. I've learned a lot about Dataflows, how to position it, what to do with it, how it works. As mentioned before, there are lots of links in the description on more content that Matthew has created. If you really want to go in deeper into Dataflows, and you probably should. If you like this content, hit the subscribe on this channel. There's way more coming. If you like this episode, please hit the like button. And with that, I'll see you next time.